April 23, 1945. A field hospital tent on Okinawa, 3 miles from the Shuri line. The rain had not stopped for 6 days. It turned the red Okinawan soil into a sucking mud that swallowed boots and equipment, and the dead with equal indifference. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, blood, and wet canvas. Corporal Daniel Reeves of the 96th Infantry Division stood near a makeshift table fashioned from ammunition crates, sorting through a collection of personal effects recovered from Japanese casualties. His hands, scrubbed pink but still bearing traces of dirt beneath the nails, moved carefully through the items, photographs bent and water-stained, small cloth bags containing rice or tea, Buddhist prayer beads, and letters, always letters, folded squares of rice paper covered in brushstroke characters he could not read, sealed in oilcloth pouches or tucked into uniform pockets close to the heart. Outside, the artillery continued its rhythmic thunder. Inside, in the small perimeter of relative safety that medicine carved out of war, Reeves set aside a stack of 17 letters, each one carefully extracted from the bodies of dead Japanese soldiers. He had been told to burn them. Personal effects of enemy dead were typically destroyed or catalogued as intelligence materials. But Reeves was a medic, not an intelligence officer, and something in the careful way these letters had been folded and preserved made him hesitate. He thought of his own letters from home, from his mother in Ohio, from the girl he had known in high school. He thought of how he kept them in a waterproof pouch against his chest. He thought of the distance between Okinawa and Ohio, and the greater distance between Okinawa and whatever villages these dead men had come from. He made a decision that would seem small in the scope of the war, invisible in the historical record, and yet devastating in its emotional mathematics. He would find a way to return them. This is not a story about mercy. It is not a story about transcending hatred or discovering shared humanity. It is a story about the crushing weight of empathy in a war that demanded its absence, about the moment when American medics became unwilling custodians of enemy grief, and about how the simple act of returning letters to the families of dead soldiers would break something fundamental in the men who received them. Japanese prisoners who had been taught that Americans were demons, only to discover they were archivists of memory. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had become a machinery of obliteration. The island-hopping campaign had reached Okinawa, the last stepping stone before the Japanese home islands. The battle, which began on April 1, 1945, would rage for 82 days and claim over 200,000 lives, American, Japanese, and Okinawan civilian. It was a battle fought in mud and rain and desperation, a battle where the Japanese strategy of gyokusai, honorable death, the smashing of the jewel, demanded that soldiers fight to the last man rather than surrender. For the Japanese military, surrender was not merely defeat. It was erasure. The Senjin-kun, the military code issued in 1941, explicitly stated, "Do not live to experience shame as a prisoner. By dying, you will avoid leaving behind the crime of a stain on your honor." This was not poetic exaggeration. It was doctrine. Japanese soldiers were told that capture meant dishonor not only for themselves, but for their families, their villages, their ancestors. They were told that Americans tortured prisoners, that surrender meant mutilation and death, that the only honorable path was to die fighting or to die by one's own hand. The result was a war where surrender became almost unthinkable. In the early Pacific campaigns, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, the ratio of Japanese prisoners to Japanese dead was staggeringly low, often less than 1%. Wounded soldiers would detonate grenades rather than be captured. Civilians on Saipan threw themselves and their children from cliffs rather than face American occupation. The calculus of honor had become a calculus of extinction, but by 1945, cracks were forming. The Japanese military was collapsing under the weight of American industrial power, and the men being fed into the Pacific meat grinder were increasingly conscripts, farmers, clerks, students, rather than the hardened professionals of the early war. These men had been indoctrinated, certainly, but the indoctrination sat uneasily alongside the reality of starvation, disease, and the knowledge that the war was lost. On Okinawa, the surrender rate crept upward. Not dramatically, still only a few thousand out of over 100,000 Japanese troops, but enough to fill prisoner-of-war enclosures, enough to present American forces with a population they had not expected and were not entirely sure how to handle. The Geneva Convention technically applied, though Japan had not ratified the 1929 version. The United States, legally and practically, treated Japanese prisoners according to its own interpretation of international law. Adequate food, medical care, protection from violence. But there was a vast gulf between legal compliance and emotional reality. American troops, brutalized by years of Pacific combat, by Japanese atrocities against prisoners, by the kamikaze attacks and the banzai charges, often viewed captured Japanese soldiers with a mixture of contempt and suspicion. The idea of treating them with anything resembling kindness was alien, even obscene, and yet the medics were different. Military medics occupy a strange position in the architecture of war. They are combatants who do not kill, soldiers whose purpose is to preserve rather than destroy. The Geneva Convention marked them as non-combatants, theoretically protected from direct targeting, identified by red crosses that were supposed to render them invisible to enemy fire. In practice, of course, medics died in enormous numbers. Japanese forces frequently ignored the Red Cross markings, viewing medics as legitimate targets. American medics learned quickly that the symbol that was supposed to protect them often made them targets, and many removed or covered their insignia in combat. But the role shaped the men who filled it. Medics saw the war differently. They dealt with bodies, broken, burned, dismembered, dying, and in that intimate engagement with mortality, nationality became secondary to biology. A sucking chest wound regardless of the uniform. A severed artery demanded the same response whether the blood was American or Japanese. This was not philosophy. It was reflex, training, the muscle memory of medicine. But it created a psychological space where empathy could survive, even thrive, in an environment designed to extinguish it. Daniel Reeves had been a medic since Leyte. He had seen men die slowly and quickly, had held pressure on wounds while mortars landed nearby, had injected morphine into soldiers who begged him for more, even as their breathing slowed toward silence. He had also treated Japanese wounded, when circumstances allowed, prisoners too injured to be dangerous, soldiers discovered in the aftermath of battle still clinging to life. He did this not out of kindness, but out of instinct, the same instinct that made him reach for a tourniquet or check for breath sounds. The body in front of him was a problem to be solved, and his hands moved to solve it. But the letters were different. The letters were not bodies, they were voices. After the battle near the Shuri line, Reeves and his unit had been tasked with clearing casualties from a section of ridge that had changed hands 3 times in as many days. The Japanese dead were numerous, sprawled in shell craters and collapsed bunkers, their bodies already bloating in the tropical heat. The graves registration units would handle the mass burials, but the medics moved through first, checking for wounded, recovering identification when possible. Reeves had found the first letter on a young Japanese soldier who could not have been older than 19. The boy, and he was a boy, smooth-faced and slight, had been killed by shrapnel, his torso torn open, his face oddly peaceful. The letter was in a small oilcloth pouch tied around his neck. Reeves removed it carefully, along with the soldier's identification tag, and set it aside. By the end of the day, he had collected 17 letters from 17 bodies. That evening, back at the field hospital, he sat with them spread before him. He could not read Japanese, but he recognized the structure of correspondence, the careful folds, the way some letters bore multiple creases as if read and reread, the ink that had run in places from moisture or sweat or tears. One letter included a small pressed flower. Another had a crude drawing in the margin, perhaps made by a child. Reeves knew what these were. They were the same thing his own letters were, tethers to home, proof that somewhere beyond the war, life continued. He asked a Nisei interpreter, Staff Sergeant Thomas Nakamura, to translate one of the letters. Nakamura was second-generation Japanese-American, born in California, and he had spent much of the war translating intercepted communications and interrogating prisoners. He was familiar with the strangeness of occupying the linguistic space between enemies. Nakamura read the letter silently, his face carefully neutral. Then he looked up at Reeves. "It's from his mother," he said. "She tells him the rice harvest was good. She asks if he is eating enough. She says his younger sister is engaged to the son of a neighbor. She tells him to come home safely." Reeves was quiet for a long moment. "Can we get these to their families?" he asked. Nakamura looked at him with an expression that was part disbelief, part exhaustion. "These men are dead. Their families don't know they're dead, and we can't exactly mail letters through Japanese postal routes." "But the prisoners," Reeves said. "We have prisoners in the enclosure. Some of them might know how to get these back after the war." Nakamura shook his head slowly. "You want to give enemy soldiers letters from their dead comrades?" "I want to give them their comrades' letters," Reeves corrected. "They're not enemy soldiers anymore. They're prisoners." It was a fine distinction, maybe a meaningless one, but it mattered to Reeves. The prisoner of war enclosure on Okinawa was a sprawling compound of barbed wire and tents, holding several thousand Japanese soldiers and Okinawan conscripts. The conditions were adequate by the standards of the Geneva Convention: rations, water, medical care, but the psychological atmosphere was toxic. Many prisoners expected to be executed. They had been told for years that Americans did not take prisoners, that capture meant torture and mutilation. When they were instead processed, fed, and housed, the cognitive dissonance was profound. Some prisoners became cooperative, even grateful. These men, often younger conscripts or Okinawan civilians pressed into service, adapted quickly to the reality that contradicted the propaganda. They answered questions, worked in labor details, accepted their status with a kind of exhausted relief. Others remained defiant, clinging to the military code even in captivity. These were often the hardcore soldiers, the veterans, the men for whom surrender was not merely defeat, but existential collapse. They refused to speak, refused to cooperate, sat in the enclosure in sullen clusters, waiting for an end they no longer believed would come. And then there were the men who were simply broken. Men who wept openly, who could not reconcile the shame of survival with the fact of their survival, who existed in a liminal state between death and life, unable to return to either. It was to this population that Daniel Reeves proposed to deliver letters from the dead. The poor U.S. military had established protocols for handling captured documents and personal effects. Anything of potential intelligence value was sent to analysis units. Anything else was typically destroyed or stored in vast warehouses where it would sit, forgotten until long after the war. The idea of returning personal letters to enemy prisoners was so far outside standard procedure that when Reeves proposed it to his commanding officer, Captain Harold Benson, the captain initially thought it was a joke. "You want to do what?" Benson asked. Reeves explained. He had letters from Japanese dead. He wanted to give them to prisoners who might be able to ensure they reached the families after the war. Benson stared at him. "Corporal, those men tried to kill you. They would have bayoneted you in your sleep if they'd had the chance. And you want to hand-deliver their mail?" "I want to return property to its rightful recipients," Reeves said. "Or as close as we can get." Benson was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one. He had seen too much, lost too many men, to have much patience for sentiment. But he also recognized that Reeves was a good medic, steady under fire, and that the war was nearly over. If this strange act of bureaucratic mercy helped Reeves process what he had seen, maybe it was worth allowing. "Fine," Benson said. "But you clear it with intelligence first, and if it causes problems, it's on you." Reeves took the letters to the intelligence section, where a young lieutenant named Peter Wu, himself a Nisei, reviewed them. Wu read through several, translating aloud. They were heartbreaking in their ordinariness. Mothers writing about gardens, wives asking about health, children drawing pictures. There was nothing of intelligence value. Wu stamped them cleared and handed them back. "Good luck," Wu said. "I hope it helps someone." Reeves was not sure who it was supposed to help, but he took the letters to the prisoner enclosure. The day Reeves entered the enclosure with the letters, the sky was overcast, the air heavy with the threat of more rain. He was accompanied by Staff Sergeant Nakamura, who would serve as translator, and 2 MPs who were there primarily to ensure nothing went wrong. The prisoners watched them approach with the blank, careful expressions of men who had learned not to expect anything good. Nakamura called out in Japanese, explaining that they had letters recovered from Japanese casualties and were seeking prisoners who might know the men or their units, who might be able to help return the letters to families after the war. At first, there was no response. The prisoners sat or stood in small groups, silent. Then, slowly, an older soldier, a sergeant based on the remnants of insignia on his torn uniform, stepped forward. His name was Yamada Kenji. He was 37, a career soldier, a veteran of China and the Philippines. He had surrendered on Okinawa after being wounded, after his entire unit was annihilated, after he had lain in a shell crater for 2 days, waiting to die and finding, to his shame, that he wanted to live. Nakamura handed Yamada the first letter and explained where it had been found. Yamada took it carefully, as if it might disintegrate. He read the name on the envelope. His face did not change, but his hands trembled slightly. "I knew this man," Yamada said quietly in Japanese. "He was in my company." His name was Suzuki Hiroshi. He was from Nagano Prefecture, Nakamura translated. Reeves nodded and handed over another letter. And then another? Of the 17 letters, Yamada recognized 6 names. Other prisoners stepped forward, hesitant at first, then more eagerly. They read names aloud, trying to place them, to connect them to faces or units. Some they recognized, some they did not. But the act of reading, of bearing witness to the names of the dead, seemed to crack something open in the enclosure. And then one of the prisoners began to cry. His name was Tanaka Masao. He was 23 years old, a conscript from a farming village in Shikoku. He had been in the army for less than a year before Okinawa, had seen almost no combat before the battle that had captured him. He was small, quiet, and had spent most of his time in the enclosure sitting alone, speaking to no one, eating little. When Nakamura handed him a letter and read the name, Kobayashi Takeshi, Tanaka's face crumpled. "That was my friend," he said in Japanese, his voice breaking. "We trained together. He died?" Nakamura nodded. "I'm sorry." This letter was found with his body. Tanaka took the letter with shaking hands. He opened it carefully, as if it were sacred. It was from Kobayashi's younger brother, written months earlier, before the invasion. The brother wrote about school, about a new puppy, about how he missed his older brother and hoped he would come home soon. Tanaka read it slowly, his tears falling onto the paper, smudging the ink. The other prisoners watched in silence. Some looked away. Some wept as well, though whether for Kobayashi or for themselves or for the cumulative weight of all the loss, it was impossible to say. Yamada, the older sergeant, stood rigid, his jaw clenched. He did not cry, but his eyes were wet. He held 3 letters in his hands, letters for men he had commanded, men who had died under his orders. He looked at Reeves, and through Nakamura, he spoke. "Why do you do this?" Yamada asked. "We are your enemies." Reeves did not have a good answer. He said, through Nakamura, "Because they should go home." Yamada stared at him for a long moment. Then he bowed, a deep, formal bow, the kind reserved for honoring the dead or acknowledging profound debt. Several other prisoners followed suit. The gesture was so unexpected, so outside the context of the war, that Reeves felt a sudden, disorienting vertigo, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. He had expected gratitude, perhaps, or hostility, or indifference. He had not expected this formalized grief, this recognition of something he could not name. In the days that followed, word spread through the enclosure about the letters. More prisoners came forward, asking if there were letters from men they knew. Reeves returned to the field hospital and spoke to other medics, asking them to preserve any personal effects they recovered from Japanese dead. The practice spread, quietly, unofficially. Medics began setting aside letters, photographs, small personal items. They brought them to the enclosure, where Nakamura and other Nisei translators helped identify names and units. It was not official policy. It was barely organized, but it became a kind of ritual, a small act of restitution in a war that offered few such acts. For the prisoners, the impact was complex and devastating. The letters confirmed deaths they had suspected, but not known. They provided closure, but closure in war is often just another name for grief. Some prisoners asked to keep the letters, planning to carry them home after the war and deliver them personally to families. Others could not bear to touch them, as if the paper itself carried the weight of the dead. But what shattered them, universally, was the realization that Americans had preserved the letters at all. The propaganda that Japanese soldiers had absorbed for years painted Americans as barbaric, subhuman, interested only in destruction and domination. They had been told that Americans would desecrate bodies, that they took trophies from the dead, that they had no concept of honor or respect. Some of this propaganda was rooted in reality. American soldiers did, on occasion, take trophies from Japanese dead, a practice that was officially condemned but unofficially tolerated in the brutality of the Pacific War. Photographs of skulls and bones, sent home as souvenirs, became minor scandals when they surfaced in the press. But here were American medics, men who had every reason to hate the Japanese, carefully preserving letters and attempting to return them. It did not fit the narrative. It could not be reconciled with the image of the demonic enemy. Yamada Kenji, the veteran sergeant, grappled with this contradiction in the days after receiving the letters. He had fought Americans in the Philippines, had seen his friends killed by American artillery and flamethrowers, had participated in banzai charges where the only goal was to kill as many Americans as possible before dying. He had been taught that Americans were cowardly, that they relied on machines because they lacked warrior spirit, that their wealth had made them soft. And yet, the medic who had returned the letters was young, maybe 22, and he had walked into the prisoner enclosure not with contempt or superiority, but with something closer to awkwardness, as if he was unsure of the gesture, but compelled to make it anyway. Yamada thought about this constantly. He thought about the letter he held for Suzuki Hiroshi, the young soldier from Nagano. Suzuki had talked often about his mother, about the letters she sent, about how he planned to return and take over the family farm. Now Suzuki was dead, buried in Okinawan mud, and Yamada held a letter from that mother, a letter asking her son to come home. The weight of it was unbearable. One evening, Yamada asked to speak to Nakamura. Through the translator, he asked a question that had been tormenting him. If they respect our dead, why do they kill us? It was a child's question, naive, but Nakamura understood what Yamada was really asking. He was asking how the enemy could be both brutal and humane, how the same nation that firebombed Tokyo could also preserve letters from dead soldiers. Nakamura, who had spent the entire war navigating this contradiction, who had faced suspicion and internment from his own country while proving his loyalty through service, did not have a satisfying answer. He said, "War is not one thing. People are not one thing." Yamada was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I was told Americans had no honor. But this," he gestured to the letters, "this is honor. Nakamura translated the statement to Reeves later. Reeves did not know what to say. He had not thought of it as honor. He had thought of it as the right thing to do, or maybe just as something he could not bring himself not to do. But for Yamada and for the other prisoners, the distinction did not matter. The act had spoken louder than any propaganda. The letters became a symbol, a recurring point of reference among the prisoners. In the enclosure, where men had little to do but wait and think, the story of the returned letters spread and grew. Some prisoners saw it as proof that surrender had been the right choice, that the Americans were not monsters, that survival was not the ultimate shame. Others saw it as a cruel trick, a psychological ploy to break their will, to make them compliant. These men remained bitter, insistent that the gesture changed nothing, that Japan had been right to fight, that defeat was temporary. But even among the hardliners, the letters created doubt. Doubt is corrosive to ideology. It does not require acceptance or agreement. It only requires the acknowledgement that the narrative might not be complete, that the enemy might be more complex than the propaganda allowed. One prisoner, a lieutenant named Fujita, who had been a schoolteacher before the war, wrote in a diary that was later recovered, "The Americans gave us back the words of the dead. I do not know what this means. I do not know if it is kindness or calculation. But I know that we were told they would mutilate our dead, and instead they preserved their letters. I know that I was told lies. I do not know what else I was told that was a lie. It was a small crack in a worldview, but cracks, once opened, tend to widen." Daniel Reeves continued his work as a medic through the end of the Okinawa campaign. He treated American wounded and, when circumstances allowed, Japanese wounded. He collected more letters, more personal effects, and brought them to the enclosure. The ritual became routine, almost mundane, though it never lost its emotional charge. In June 1945, as the battle finally ground to its brutal conclusion, Reeves was wounded by shrapnel from a mortar round. The wounds were not life-threatening, but they were serious enough to warrant evacuation. He was sent to a hospital ship, then to a facility in Hawaii, and eventually home to Ohio. He was discharged in November 1945, after the war had ended, after the atomic bombs, after the surrender. He carried with him a small notebook in which he had recorded the names of the Japanese soldiers whose letters he had returned. 17 names, written in his careful script, with notes about which prisoners had taken custody of the letters. He kept the notebook for the rest of his life, though he rarely looked at it. Years later, in an oral history interview conducted in 1982, Reeves was asked why he had done it, why he had spent time and effort on something so outside the scope of his duties. He thought for a long time before answering. "I guess I couldn't stand the idea of those letters just being burned," he said. Someone had written them. Someone had carried them. Someone had died with them. It seemed like that should matter. The interviewer asked if he thought it had made a difference. Reeves shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe to the prisoners, maybe not. But it made a difference to me." After the war, the question of what to do with Japanese prisoners became a logistical and political challenge. Tens of thousands were repatriated over the course of 1946 and 1947, sent back to a Japan that had been devastated by war, occupied by foreign troops, and forced to confront the reality of total defeat. The repatriation process was chaotic, slow, and fraught with difficulties. Many prisoners had no homes to return to. Their villages had been bombed, their families displaced or dead. Among those repatriated was Yamada Kenji, the veteran sergeant who had received letters for men in his unit. He returned to Japan in early 1946, carrying with him 3 letters and a commitment he had made to himself in the prisoner enclosure. He would find the families and deliver the letters in person. It took him 2 years. Japan was in ruins, transportation was sporadic, records were incomplete or destroyed. But Yamada traveled to Nagano Prefecture and found the family of Suzuki Hiroshi. He traveled to Osaka and found the widow of another soldier. He traveled to a small village in Kyushu and found the parents of a third. In each case, the delivery of the letter was met with tears, with gratitude, with a grief that had been held in suspension, waiting for confirmation of what families had already known in their hearts. Yamada did not speak much during these visits. He bowed, he presented the letters, he answered questions when asked. He did not tell the families that the letters had been returned by an American medic. He did not know if it would comfort them or confuse them, or add another layer of pain to an already unbearable situation. But he thought about it. He thought about the young American corporal who had walked into the prisoner enclosure with a stack of letters and an uncertain expression. He thought about the moment when he had bowed, when the formal gesture of respect had felt both entirely necessary and entirely inadequate. He thought about how the war had taught him to hate, and how a small act by an enemy had not erased that hatred but had complicated it, had forced him to hold two contradictory truths at once: that the Americans had killed his friends, and that they had also honored them. In 1953, Yamada wrote a letter to the U.S. Army, addressed to no one in particular, asking if it was possible to locate a medic named Daniel Reeves, who had served on Okinawa in 1945. The letter was filed and forgotten. It would not be discovered until decades later during an archival project, and by then Yamada was dead. But the gesture mattered. The attempt to reach across the chasm of the war, to acknowledge what had been done, mattered. The practice of returning personal effects to enemy dead did not become standard procedure. It remained an anomaly, a small irregularity in the vast bureaucratic machinery of war. But it was not unique to Reeves. Other medics, other soldiers, made similar gestures in the Pacific and in Europe. They preserved letters, returned rings, facilitated communication between prisoners and their families. These acts were rarely documented, rarely praised, rarely remembered. But they happened, and they mattered to the men who experienced them. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt, and as the narrative of the Pacific War was negotiated and renegotiated, the stories of American medics returning letters became part of a broader, more complicated understanding of the conflict. The war was not only brutality and atrocity, though it was certainly those things. It was also moments of grace that defied the logic of total war, moments when individuals refused to let hatred be the only truth. This was not redemption. The war killed millions. The firebombing of Japanese cities, the atomic bombs, the wholesale destruction of civilian populations, none of that was erased by a few returned letters. But the letters were a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, even in a war that demanded dehumanization, some men chose to see the humanity in the enemy. And for the prisoners who wept when those letters were returned, the gesture was not about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about the collapse of a lie. They had been told that Americans were monsters, and here was evidence, tangible and undeniable, that the truth was more complex. There is a photograph, taken in the prisoner enclosure on Okinawa in May 1945, that was discovered in a military archive in 2003. It shows a group of Japanese prisoners standing in a loose cluster, holding letters and photographs. The image quality is poor, grainy, faded, the figures indistinct. But in the foreground, one prisoner is clearly visible, his head bowed, his hands holding a folded piece of paper. His face is obscured, but his posture conveys everything: the weight of grief, the burden of survival, the impossible task of carrying the dead home. The photograph is not famous. It has not been reproduced in textbooks or documentaries. It exists in an archive folder labeled Okinawa POW Operations, MISC, alongside thousands of other forgotten images, but it endures. And in its quiet, grainy anonymity, it tells a story that is both specific and universal. The story of how war breaks men, and how small acts of decency, insufficient and inadequate as they are, can sometimes offer a foothold against that breaking. Daniel Reeves died in 1998, in the same Ohio town where he had been born. His obituary mentioned his service as a medic in the Pacific, his Purple Heart, his decades working as a pharmacist. It did not mention the letters. His family knew the story, vaguely, but he had not spoken of it often. It was one small part of a war that had been filled with larger, louder traumas. At his funeral, his grandson found the notebook among his effects, the list of names, the careful notations. The grandson, curious, did some research and learned about the practice of returning letters to prisoners, about the small, unofficial efforts that men like his grandfather had made. He wrote an article for a local veterans magazine. The article was read by a Japanese historian researching prisoner of war experiences, and through a series of connections and correspondence, the historian learned about Yamada Kenji's letter to the U.S. Army, the one that had been filed and forgotten. The historian published a paper connecting these threads: Reeves, Yamada, the letters, the prisoners who wept. The paper was not widely read, but it was read by some, and the story began to circulate in small circles of military historians and veterans organizations. In 2005, a Japanese television documentary team traveled to Ohio and interviewed Reeves's family. They traveled to Okinawa and filmed the battlefield where the letters had been recovered. They found surviving prisoners, now in their 80s and 90s, and asked them about the experience. One man, Tanaka Masao, the conscript who had wept over the letter from his friend's younger brother, was interviewed in his small home in Shikoku. He was 83 years old, frail, his hands trembling with age. But when the interviewer asked about the letters, his eyes cleared, and he spoke with a precision that suggested he had thought about this moment often. "I was taught that Americans had no souls," he said in Japanese. "I was taught that they would desecrate our dead." And then a young American medic, not much older than I was, handed me a letter from my friend. He did not speak Japanese. I did not speak English. But he gave me my friend's words. I have thought about that moment every day since. The interviewer asked what it meant to him. Tanaka was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It meant that I had been lied to. It meant that the war was not what I was told it was. It meant that my friend's death, my shame at surviving, it was all more complicated than honor or duty. It meant that the enemy could also be kind, and that kindness did not erase the war, but it changed what the war meant." He paused, then added, "I wept then. I weep now. I will weep when I die. Those tears are all I have to give." The letters themselves, the physical objects, have largely been lost to time. Some were delivered to families, as Yamada did. Some were kept by prisoners and brought home, then lost or destroyed over the decades. Some remained in the enclosure, left behind when prisoners were repatriated, and were eventually discarded or burned. But the memory of the letters endures. In Japan, in the small museums dedicated to the war, in the oral histories collected from veterans, the story of American medics returning letters appears again and again. It is not a central narrative. It does not define the war, but it is a recurring note, a small counterpoint to the larger themes of brutality and sacrifice. And in that recurrence, there is a kind of truth. The war was horror. The war was loss. But the war was also this: a young medic in a muddy tent on Okinawa, sorting through the possessions of dead enemies, deciding that their letters should go home. A veteran sergeant in a prisoner enclosure, bowing to an enemy because the gesture was the only way to express what words could not. A conscript weeping over a letter from a friend's brother. Weeping not only for the friend, but for the collapse of everything he had been taught. These moments do not redeem the war. They do not make it noble or meaningful, but they complicate it. They insist that even in the machinery of total war, individual choices mattered. That empathy was not weakness. That seeing the enemy as human did not mean betraying one's own side. It meant acknowledging a larger, more terrible truth: that war makes enemies of people who, in any other circumstance, might have had no reason to hate each other. On Okinawa today, there are memorials to the dead, Japanese, American, Okinawan. They stand on the cliffs and in the fields where the battle raged. Tourists visit, take photographs, read plaques. The rain still falls, turning the red soil to mud, and the wind moves through the grass as it did in 1945. Somewhere in the archives, in the forgotten folders and dusty boxes, there are records of the letters, lists of names, inventory sheets, notes from medics and translators. They are not dramatic documents. They do not reveal secrets or change histories. But they are there, quiet evidence that in the worst of circumstances, some men chose to honor the dead, even enemy dead, because the alternative, letting the letters burn, letting the voices be silenced, was unbearable. And somewhere, in a village in Shikoku or Nagano or Osaka, there may still be a letter, folded and fragile, kept in a drawer or a box, a letter that traveled from a battlefield to a prison enclosure to a grieving family, carried by the hands of men who had every reason to destroy it and chose not to. That letter, if it still exists, is not a symbol of reconciliation. It is not proof of shared humanity or the triumph of good over evil. It is simply a letter, ink on paper, words written in love or duty or loneliness, preserved by accident or intention, returned because one young medic could not stand the thought of it being burned. And in the end, that is enough. Not to redeem the war, not to erase the grief, but to insist, quietly and stubbornly, that in the calculus of hatred and violence, there were also these small acts, insufficient, inadequate, but undeniably real. The prisoners wept when they received the letters. They wept for their dead friends, for their own shame, for the collapse of the lies they had been told. But they also wept, perhaps, for the recognition that the enemy, too, understood grief. That the Americans, for all their machines and their bombs and their industrial power, also knew what it meant to lose someone, to carry letters close to the heart, to want, desperately, for the words to make it home. That recognition did not end the war, but it changed what the war meant, at least for the men in that enclosure on that rainy day in April 1945. And in the decades that followed, as they returned to their villages and farms and tried to rebuild lives from the ruins, they carried that knowledge with them. The knowledge that the world was more complicated than the propaganda, that the enemy was more human than the doctrine, and that sometimes, in the midst of the worst things humans can do to each other, there are also moments of grace. Small moments, insufficient moments, but moments that refuse, stubbornly, to be forgotten. And so the letters, in memory if not in fact, continue their journey home.